Right now, in this moment, you are carrying a craving that is 2 million years old. It is quiet, dormant. You have probably never acted on it, but it is there, a biological instruction built into your nervous system so far back in evolutionary history that it predates the human species as we know it. And every single one of your ancestors acted on it. Regularly, deliberately. They ate dirt. Not by accident, not out of desperation, not because they didn't know any better. They sought out specific types of soil-red clay from riverbeds, white kaolin from underground deposits, mineral-rich earth from locations passed down through generations like a recipe. They knew which types to eat and which to avoid. They ate it in precise amounts. And they were, as it turns out, entirely right to do so. Geophagy, the deliberate consumption of earth, has been documented on every inhabited continent. It appears in ancient Greek medical texts from 400 BCE, in Roman trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean, in the sacred pregnancy practices of the Luo people in Kenya, in Java, where small rolls of edible clay called ampo are still sold at local markets, in Haiti, where a mud cookie called bonbonte made from soil salt and shortening has been sold by street vendors for centuries. The Museum of Eatable Earth in Amsterdam currently catalogs over 600 varieties of soil consumed by human beings worldwide. 600. This was not a disorder. This was technology. The archaeological record for geophagy reaches further back than almost anything else we know about human behavior. At Kalambo Falls on the border of Zambia and Tanzania, the archaeological record shows something that changes the timeline considerably. Not surface soil scraped up by accident, deliberate clay mining beneath the topsoil. The clay layers below had been dug down to intentionally extracted and consumed. The bones found alongside those deposits belong to Homo habilis, a species that predates our own by roughly 1.5 million years. Think about what that means. Long before Homo sapiens existed, before language, before fire as a controlled technology, before anything we'd recognize as culture, a proto-human was selecting and eating specific types of clay from the earth. The behavior we associate with poverty, mental illness, or desperation is in evolutionary terms older than our own species. The first written record comes from Hippocrates writing around 400 BCE. He recorded the practice among pregnant women in ancient Greece and described it not as a pathology, but as a clinical pattern, something that happened consistently at a particular stage of life in a particular group. By the time the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder was writing in the 1st century CE, clay consumption had been fully formalized. The ancient world had developed something remarkably close to a pharmaceutical supply chain for it. Specific clays from specific regions were authenticated with official stamps and traded across the Mediterranean as a certified medicinal product. They were called terra sigillata, sealed earths. The clay from the island of Lemnos was so prized that its annual harvest was supervised by an Ottoman governor all the way into the 16th century. You could buy it at market. There were quality controls. These were not people eating random mud off the ground. But here's what's fascinating. For the better part of the 19th and 20th centuries, Western science dismissed geophagy as a symptom of something pathological, a condition called pica, the compulsive consumption of non-food substances. Doctors attributed it to iron deficiency, to zinc deficiency, to malnutrition. The thinking went, the body craves earth because it lacks minerals and earth contains minerals. It sounded logical. It was largely wrong. In the early 1980s, researchers began testing the minerals in the most commonly eaten clays. What they found complicated the theory considerably. Kaolin and other frequently consumed clays do not release their minerals into the human digestive system. The iron and zinc locked inside clay particles are not bioavailable. The body cannot absorb them. In fact, clay can actively bind to micronutrients already present in the digestive tract, temporarily reducing iron absorption from food. So eating clay for minerals doesn't work. And yet for 2 million years, humans kept eating it. Something else was going on. But here's the part nobody talks about. The real reason turns out to be far stranger and far more deliberate than anyone had initially assumed. In 2011, Sarah Young, a nutritional scientist at Cornell, set out to do something nobody had done systematically before: map the pattern. She and her colleague Paul Sherman pulled together 482 documented accounts of geophagy from cultures across the globe, 2 centuries of anthropological records assembled into a single database. What they were looking for was not what people were eating. It was who was eating it, when and where. The pattern was immediate. Geophagy occurred most consistently in two groups: pregnant women in the first trimester and young children under 2 years old. Not iron-deficient adults, not starving populations, the two groups that are biologically the most vulnerable to infectious disease and the most sensitive to environmental toxins. Young and Sherman proposed what became known as the protection hypothesis. The argument was this: clay is not nutritional, it is pharmaceutical. Specifically, it functions as a physical barrier in the gut, a coating on the intestinal lining that prevents pathogens, parasites, and toxic plant compounds from being absorbed into the bloodstream before the immune system can respond. Paul Sherman put it plainly: clay is a natural medicament that acts much like commercial kaopectate. Kaopectate, the over-the-counter diarrhea medication, originally contained kaolin clay as its primary active ingredient. The pharmaceutical industry had been manufacturing and selling a gut protection product whose mechanism of action was precisely the mechanism that pregnant women in rural Kenya had understood for thousands of years. Without clinical trials, without a patent, without a brand name, the clay doesn't kill pathogens, it adsorbs them. Think of it as a slow-moving trap running through your digestive system. Toxins, viruses, bacteria latch onto the clay surface and get carried out of the body before they can cause damage. Young called it a mud mask for the gut. Consider the environment in which this behavior evolved. Geophagy is overwhelmingly most common in tropical and subtropical regions, which are also the regions with the highest burden of foodborne illness, intestinal parasites, and plants that produce natural defensive toxins. The first trimester of pregnancy is the most immunologically vulnerable period in a woman's life. It is also in traditional diets heavy in wild plants, the period of highest exposure to naturally occurring alkaloids and tannins, the chemical compounds plants produce to protect themselves from being eaten. Clay binds those compounds before they enter the bloodstream. Animals run the same system. Macaws in the Amazon fly to specific clay-lick sites along riverbanks to neutralize the alkaloids in the seeds they eat. African elephants travel hours to clay-rich cliff faces, a behavior researchers initially attributed to sodium craving, but more recent analysis links to pathogen protection. Japanese macaques consume clay, specifically during the cherry blossom season, precisely when the tree's new buds contain peak concentrations of defensive tannins. The behavior is not random or desperate. It is calibrated to exposure. The sophistication of traditional geophagy practices makes considerably more sense once the protection hypothesis is on the table. The Luo people of Kenya specify red clays for pregnant women consumed in controlled amounts at particular points in gestation, passed down with the same care as medical instruction. The cultural framing connects it to blood and fertility, but the functional mechanism is a targeted gastrointestinal protectant applied during the most biologically critical window of human reproduction. In 16th century Germany, the protective properties of clay were understood well enough to test in court. A prisoner in the region of Hohenlohe had been condemned to death. Before his execution, he was reportedly given a lethal dose of mercury, an experiment in the medicinal claims of terra sigillata clay. The prisoner consumed the clay. He survived. According to the historical accounts, to the amazement of the court, the convict survived the mercury poisoning and was merely banished instead. Terra sigillata was not folk superstition. It was, by the empirical standards of its time, a verified medical treatment. And here is the part almost nobody quotes. Hippocrates, writing in 400 BCE, did not describe geophagy as a disease. He described it as a clinical observation, a pattern concentrated in pregnant women associated with specific outcomes. The framing of geophagy as a disorder, a pathology, a psychiatric symptom, is a development of Western medicine over the last 2 centuries. It emerged at precisely the moment when medicine adopted a nutritional model it used to explain most non-standard food behaviors, and geophagy didn't fit. The mineral hypothesis didn't hold up. There was no obvious nutrient being supplied, so the practice was classified as aberrant. 2 million years of deliberate, culturally transmitted, functionally effective clay consumption. Classified as a psychiatric symptom. The craving has not disappeared. You have felt it yourself, not as a desire to eat dirt, but as something in that direction. Every child without instruction puts earth in their mouth. The behavior is so universal that pediatricians gave it a name: mouthing. Most parents assume it is random exploration, but it peaks between 12 and 24 months, exactly the window Young identified as the period of highest biological vulnerability to pathogens. Not random, timed, And consider this. When rain hits dry ground, it releases a compound called geosmin, the source of what most people describe as one of the best smells in nature. Humans can detect it at concentrations as low as 5 parts per trillion, a sensitivity far sharper than any obvious purpose would explain. Some researchers have proposed that this acuity is an orientation signal, a remnant of the instinct to locate the specific patches of earth worth seeking out. The smell of wet soil doesn't repel us. It never has. It pulls us in. In a study of low-income pregnant women attending clinics in southern Mississippi, roughly 38% reported cravings for dirt or clay. Not all of them acted on it. The social stigma in modern Western contexts is considerable, a behavior that was once passed down through generations, that was formalized in ancient trade routes, that survived Roman pharmacy and 16th century courtrooms, now carries significant shame. But the impulse persists. It appears in women who were never told about it, in communities that have thoroughly medicalized it, in patients who describe the craving as visceral and inexplicable. Pica, the clinical term, encompasses cravings for clay chalk, ice laundry starch, and a range of non-food substances. Doctors routinely screen for it during prenatal visits. The standard clinical response is iron supplementation. The iron supplementation rarely eliminates the craving, which makes sense if the craving was never about iron to begin with. There is a quieter argument running beneath all of this, one that researchers are increasingly willing to articulate. For most of human evolutionary history, people had constant daily contact with soil through food, through tools, through handling, through deliberate consumption. The microorganisms in that soil and the microorganisms in the human gut may have co-evolved across millions of years. Research published in Nature Communications in 2025 described the relationship between soil plant and human gut microbiomes as a deeply interconnected axis, one where disrupting contact with soil disrupts microbial diversity in ways we are only beginning to measure. The modern diet has removed soil from the equation almost entirely. Vegetables are washed until sterile. Children are steered away from mud. The instinct to put earth in your mouth is treated as something to be corrected. And when our stomachs hurt, we take cupectate. The active ingredient in kaopectate for most of its commercial history was kaolin clay. We did not discover this. We reverse engineered it. There is a version of history in which medicine began with clinical trials and peer-reviewed journals, a modern achievement built carefully on centuries of superstition. And then there is the other version, the one where for 2 million years the human body was running its own experiment, where the craving for red clay in the first trimester of pregnancy is a pharmacological signal refined by natural selection across millions of reproductive cycles, tested in environments far more pathogen-dense than anything most people alive today will ever encounter, where the women who knew which clay to eat and when and how much were practitioners of a medicine that worked, not because someone told them it worked, but because the ones who stopped practicing it didn't survive long enough to teach it to the next generation. We look at a pregnant woman eating dirt and see superstition, poverty, a disorder to be treated. But 2 million years is a very long clinical trial. The body's deepest instincts are not randomly generated. They were earned through catastrophic failure at a scale and across a time span we can barely conceive of. Your craving for dirt is not a malfunction. It is in all likelihood one of the reasons you exist at all. Somewhere in the world right now, a pregnant woman is eating a small piece of red clay from a patch of earth she has known her entire life. She learned it from her mother. Her mother learned it from hers. The clay is the same clay. The biology is the same biology. The practice is 2 million years old. And it still works.